In this video, we're taking a look at strawberry fields and the Beatles' childhood homes. Now, our first port of call is George Harrison's childhood home, which is about 2 miles away from Hunts Cross train station, which is on the Merseyrail network, and it's south of the city centre. And as you can see, it is a fairly straightforward walk, not too many twists and turns to get there. And the main thing to bear in mind is that George's childhood home is still actually a private residence, so I didn't really want to get too close and be standing in their front garden pointing a camera at their windows and at their front door, which wouldn't be very polite, to be honest. But his house is located in a grove, and it's got this large green space in the middle of it with houses all around the outer edge. And as we pan round to the right, you'll see that George's former childhood home is in the middle of a terrace row. It's immediately to the right of the house that you can see with the solar panels on it, and it does actually have a blue plaque on there to commemorate that George lived there. Our next port of call was John Lennon's childhood home, where he lived with his auntie. Now, we did have a bit of confusion with this one in terms of mapping. Google Maps was less than helpful, and it did try to send us in the wrong direction, and we ended up probably walking an extra couple of miles than we needed to. As it was, the quickest route is 3.5 miles away, but it took us more like 5 miles, maybe even 6, before we actually got there, so it was a bit of a killer, to be quite honest. Now, on the day that we arrived there, I actually found that there were 2 things that were a slight pain. First of all, there was a lot of building work going on at the house itself. A lot of restoration work, probably to the roof, was happening, so there's quite a bit of scaffolding on the one side of the house. And as well as that, the bushes and the trees have become very, very overgrown. Now, normally speaking, you can't just walk into this house and pay an admission fee to go in. It is actually by appointment only and strictly bookings in advance. But when you go in there, it is a perfect recreation of a 1950s typical suburban house. But the one overriding thing that I didn't expect is how noisy it was round there. It is actually on quite a busy dual carriageway into the city centre, so there is a lot of traffic noise, cars whizzing by frequently. But if you're a real die-hard Beatles fan, I'm sure it's worth a visit and actually going in there and seeing the house for itself. From the pictures I've seen, it does look very, very detailed and very good. Now, just around the corner from John's house is Strawberry Fields, and these gates are quite famous, and if you're a Beatles fan, you'll know about them, and many people have visited them over the years, and it's still covered in graffiti, as you can see from the photograph I took from the day when I was there. Now, there is one surprising fact about these gates that I wasn't aware of, which I'll explain a little bit more when we look inside the grounds of Strawberry Fields a little bit later. Now, originally this building was primarily a residence, and then it became a home primarily for children and was actually started by the Salvation Army, and this is one of the first buildings that the Salvation Army used for this purpose and where their movement really got going. Today, the site of the house is actually a museum and a very nice cafe, and the grounds have all been perfectly remade and repurposed as a garden of commemoration, partly for the house that stood there, but mostly for John Lennon's message of peace, which ran through all of his music. So once you go into the grounds of the museum, and as you can see, the main building stands on a bank which is actually on the same site that the house originally stood on, and the gardens are the original gardens in the original location. So it hasn't been massively overdeveloped. They've tried to keep the general layout exactly as it was. The original house was actually demolished in the late 60s, early 70s. And when you stand in the garden, there is a glass plate which is actually designed so that you can see the house in its original location as you look through it. The house was demolished in the 1970s due to the precarious nature of the wood inside the buildings. So all of the staircase and the windows and the floorboards were apparently so full of dry rot and woodworm that it was just too dangerous to consider restoring it. So the house was demolished, and residents at the time of demolition were told to close their windows to stop spores from the dry rot from actually flying through the air and potentially landing in their house and causing it to spread in their own properties. So it does sound like it was in pretty dire shape when they decided to pull it down. So the glass plate there is in the original location, so when you look at it you can see the building as it was all those years ago, which I think is quite a nice touch. Now, as you wander around the gardens, you're going to see lots of little phrases, such as the ones that are on screen now, from John's songs, all the ones that talk about peace mostly, and some of the more bizarre ones as well. Now, as I said earlier, the gates at the front of Strawberry Fields do have a hidden history. The gates that you see now at the front of Strawberry Fields are not the originals. They are replicas that were made and put in place around 2012, I believe. The main purpose of that being to avoid the originals being stolen or vandalised and damaged in some way. And the original gates now sit inside the grounds. And these are the gates, so these are the actual ones. It was just deemed safer to not have them on the main road for somebody to have a go at them if they wanted to. But you can still see them if you go into the museum and the grounds. Now at the far end, you'll see this bandstand in the shape of a military drum. And it does have a fantastic mural inside. And it does have this wonderful tiled floor. And you've got the mural depicting the Beatles in the centre. And again, the whole message is all about peace and understanding. Now, if you go inside the museum itself, which you do have to pay to visit, and you do have to book that in advance if you can actually book slots on the day if you want to. And at the time of visiting, it costs around £12 to go in there for an adult. And I would say it is well worth a visit, because this does give you a fascinating insight into the history of the building of the Salvation Army and why they ended up starting the movement and how Strawberry Fields came to be a very important part of it. And you also get a lot of detail about John Lennon's childhood and how John used to visit Strawberry Fields as he was a local resident, and he used to play in the grounds and in the trees nearby. And it's very much an important part of his childhood, which of course led to the famous song Strawberry Fields Forever. And there are some interesting artefacts in the museum, and without spoiling too much of it, here's just a quick brief glimpse of some of the things you can see. And you've got that fantastic mural made out of pictures that all form to make John's face on the back wall. You've got some interesting artefacts from the 50s and 60s, some rock and roll memorabilia. You've also got, at the time of visiting, the very famous piano that John actually played and wrote the song Imagine on. And of course, this piano was purchased in the early 2000s at auction by George Michael, the late musician. And at the time, he was very much slated for buying it because it was seen as another rich man's plaything that would never see the light of day again, and it was a vanity thing. But he proved everybody wrong, because he decided to send this piano around the world on tour, and it would go to various museums and various public places to be put on display. The whole purpose of it really was to promote peace and tolerance, And this piano is now very well travelled and has been round the world at least a couple of times already. So I'm not sure exactly how long it's going to be at Strawberry Fields. So if you want to see it, get there quickly, because I doubt whether it will be there forever, as I think it will eventually go back on its world tour. So I don't think it will be there forever, and it will be back on tour eventually. So if you do want to see it, go to Strawberry Fields sooner rather than later. But I can't stress enough how worthwhile the museum is, and also the staff are wonderful. The cafe is pretty good as well. So generally it's a great place to visit. And if you're a fan of John Lennon and a fan of the Beatles, it's become a bit of a mecca now, and lots of people from all over the world do go there if they come to Liverpool. So once we got out of the museum, the next port of call was to visit the childhood home of Paul McCartney. Now, relatively speaking, this was the shortest walking distance we'd had so far. So it was only just over a mile to get to his house. Again, his home is owned by the National Trust and is by appointment only, with the numbers strictly limited because of the size of the house. And again, it's a mid-terrace property, and it's actually been refurbished and put back into the style as it would have been when McCartney's family lived there. So very much again in a 1950s, 1960s style. And it is in an ordinary residential area, but I'm sure the residents must get annoyed sometimes, because there are coach parties that pull up with hordes of people that get off just to look at the property, even if they don't go into it. It must get very noisy and very busy at times. I know when I popped by there, I was only there for about 10 minutes. There was at least 2 coach parties arrived, with at least 40-50 people on each getting off to view and photograph the building. But again, if you're a die-hard Beatles fan and you want to go and pay a visit, I think it's well worth it, as it has been put back into the style that it would have been in when McCartney lived there. So you get a real idea of what it was like to live in that home. So our final visit was to Ringo Starr's childhood home. So this required us to walk from Paul McCartney's house at least a couple of miles to get to the nearest railway station. And then once we're on Merseyrail again, we headed for Brunswick station, just outside the city centre. Now, Ringo's home is by far the closest to the city itself. And I would also say it's probably the most humble of all of the homes. So once you get off the train, it's about a 20-minute walk, and it is only a mile, but it is mostly uphill. And bearing in mind that we'd probably walked something in the region of 10 or 11 miles by that point, even the slightest hill was starting to feel more than a little tiring. But eventually you'll get to Ringo's house, and when you arrive there, it's actually in a street that is now pedestrianised. I'm not sure it would have been necessarily when Ringo lived there way back in the late 50s and early 60s. In fact, Ringo lived here until he pretty well got married in 1964, I believe. So this is the approach to it, and where the road ends and the pedestrianised section begins. And this is the house itself. Now, from what I can gather, this is actually owned by a Beatles fan who purchased this at auction in 2016. And it does seem that the property is empty at the moment, and it does seem like there is some work going on inside. So I have no idea what the future plans for this property are. But it is in a fairly quiet street, so who knows what the future holds for it. But at the moment it is empty. And as I said, it is by far the closest to the city centre. So, there you have it. So that's Strawberry Fields and all 4 of the Beatles' childhood homes. Now also bear in mind, there are other properties that the Beatles' families lived in over the years, and you do have the actual birthplaces of the Beatles that can be visited. I think most recently George Harrison's birthplace has been commemorated this year in 2024 with a blue plaque. So if you're feeling brave enough, you can walk like I did. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, because it is a very long way. But it is possible to hop around on the trains and the buses to get to all of these properties should you want to go and view them. Or you can take the lazy option and just drive there, which would probably be the easiest in all honesty. So thank you for watching. If you could please, as ever, like, comment and subscribe, that would be very good for us. And we'll see you on the next video.